Hello and welcome to my little segment of Bent TV. I'm David Hunt. You know that though, you've seen me here before. Hey, my guest today, she's a friend. I've known her for a long time, which means she must be old if I've known her a long time. No, she's not. She's only 18, but I think she's told everyone that about 6 times now, so that's not working. Founder and a director of this amazing company. We'll get to that a little bit later. I don't want to give it away right now. Very experienced in communication and public relations, a big supporter of the arts, and that's how I know her mostly, which is fantastic. An executive networker and is in local and international media. Over 15 years in the game. Wow. Good on her for that. And with a portfolio of clients that include the arts, as I mentioned, entertainment, design, hospitality. Involved with Joy 94.9. Again, I've come across her in that capacity. We'll talk about that with the flagship show, Saturday Magazine. Ooh, she's on one of the important shows. Fiona Brook, hello and welcome.
Hello, David. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. All right, so we've got so much to talk about with you because you've had an extraordinary career. And what's the name of the company that you're founder and director of?
Zilla Brook, Publicity.
Right, and which is doing extremely well these days, isn't it?
Well, we're keeping very busy. Mostly for a while now, most of our work's been focused on the arts and festivals.
Yep.
And we're doing more music and film, and we have some fantastic clients coming up for 2024. Zilla Brook turns 13 in March.
Wow. Now, the wonderful thing about it is, on odd occasions when I've spoken to you about your company, and you've said, oh, we're actually doing this for free, and like, good on you for being, supportive of the arts in that way, because it must be tough, like, and especially during COVID where everything closed down, and here you are still supporting with certain little arts organisations.
Some projects we do pro bono, because a fledgling arts festival needs support, and so from when it's something new where they're supporting artists, that's the main reason that I created a company like Zilla Brook, because I wanted to spend more of my PR experience working with artists and supporting artists. So in some cases that does mean doing some little pro bono jobs to help people get started. Yep,
brilliant. Well, congratulations on that. And we'll come back and talk about it more. So let's start off, give us your life story. A little girl growing up, where?
Euroa.
There's that
Victorian countryside.
Right.
So I grew up on a farm. I'm a farm girl, which is hard to believe.
Very hard to believe.
I grew up on a sheep farm, outside of Euroa, and
where is that? I know the name, but I'm not sure where it is.
Just go straight up the Hume, and then you go past Seymour, but before Benalla.
Right. Okay.
So I grew up out there.
And how was it? like growing up on a farm.
I did love it. I don't know if I really loved it when I was a child, but I didn't know, I didn't know any better. But we spent a lot of time coming back and forth to Melbourne. We had a lot of relatives and family in Melbourne. So we were up in Melbourne quite regularly.
Right.
And when I think back on it, I would say that growing up on a farm was really beautiful. And we had endless amounts of space, and we, were very much left to our own devices.
Yep.
My parents were very busy because I had a big family. There were 5 of us.
Whoa.
And so my dad was very busy farming. My mum was very busy, house managing and
5
things
kids,
like that. But we grew up with lots of home cooked food. All of our, everything was cooked at home.
And far from a town, or were you?
About 20 minutes drive.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how did you get to school, in primary school?
School bus. So we would walk down the road, walk down our little street, catch the school bus, which took us to another stop, and then we'd catch the next school bus.
Whoa. How long did that take you to get to school?
Well, in the morning it was a short trip. It was about 30 minutes. But in the evening, the bus went the long way round.
Right.
And so it would take maybe 45 minutes.
Yeah.
Sometimes maybe an hour to get home, because you have to stop and drop all the kids off at each gate.
Yeah. And did you have lots of friends in school days?
Yeah, lots of friends. I had friends on my street, and we would ride our bicycle. Well, I don't want to say street.
That's what I'm thinking, street.
And we would ride our bikes and meet each other in the middle But we also had a swimming pool. So in the summertime,
everyone
you
wanted to
know,
hang out with you. Yeah.
we had local kids that would come and swim in our pool.
Yeah.
And then in town, sometimes you would stay with your friends that lived in the little town. Yeah, it was really fun. I mean, I don't have any real clue of what we actually did, but, you know, I loved making clothes. So I would sew. One of my sisters was really very creative. So we would, you know, draw and paint. And
Brothers?
no brothers, all girls.
All girls.
Yep, so I'm the middle child.
Right. Well, how did Dad react to that, not having anyone to help on the farm?
Well, we did help. So that's what we did. Sometimes on weekends we were helping on the farm. So we'd be marking lambs or moving sheep or, you know, helping in the shearing shed.
Did you like it or dislike that part of it?
No, I liked it.
Yeah.
I mean, I like animals. So
Yeah.
when you're marking sheep, you have to pick up the little lamb. Essentially, there's quite a lot of tough things about farming. And so my dad actually kept us quite separate from some of the not very nice parts of
good
farming.
on you. Yep.
But we did help around,
Yep.
and then eventually my dad did employ a worker, a farmhand.
Yep. What about high school? Did you continue in the country town for high school?
I went to high school in the local town for 2 years,
Yeah.
and then was sent to boarding school in Melbourne.
In Melbourne, right.
Yeah.
Where'd you go?
To Melbourne Girls Grammar.
Okay. Was that a boarding?
Yeah, that's a boarding school.
Right.
So very traditionally for farming families,
Yeah.
they send their kids to boarding school, and often from year 9 they send kids because,
Right.
you know, money's not always that flash, and so when you're sending your kids to a boarding school, so you send them from year 9. So I did 9, 10, 11, 12
Yeah.
at the school.
How did you cope with that, being separated from your family?
Fine. I mean, all my
Yeah?
sisters went.
Right.
So, you know, I
And
was so used to it.
Where were you in the picking order of?
I'm in the middle.
Right, okay. So you had 2 sisters that had already done it.
Yeah. So
Right.
we were, you know, we knew from a very early age we were going, and it was exciting. And you
Yeah.
were in the centre of the city, you know, in South Yarra, just near the Botanic Gardens. And I loved the idea of being in the city. And so for me, it was perfect.
So what did you do after you left school?
I went to study fashion, but I dropped out. I'm actually a dropout. I never got a degree. So I dropped out of fashion school and went and I just wanted to work. I wasn't that interested in study. I was really fiercely independent. I wanted to make my own money, and so I worked in the fashion industry. And I
Okay.
worked in retail, and then I worked for some fashion designers, and I learnt the trade of making and constructing garments, and I learnt that by working in the business as opposed to studying.
Well, why did you leave that part of the world? You know, like if you were getting so involved in it, and you know, like the rag trade is one that you can, you know, like learning is better than doing studying in some ways.
It is. Well, I did start my own business, and I had a lingerie brand in the 1980s.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, so I did stay in it for quite a long time, and I ran the lingerie brand for probably around about 4 years.
Why? Why that? Lingerie?
It was just like cool and interesting at the time. You
Okay.
know, Madonna was out, and,
right.
and there were bustiers and beautiful lace outfits, and it was just of the time. And there wasn't really many other people doing it. So that's why I thought it would be really fun to do lingerie.
Yeah.
I used to collect a lot of vintage corsets and vintage lingerie, and
So beautiful, aren't they? You know, like when you see burlesque performers and all that, you know, because all you see is the bustiers and all that, and then they take them off. But they're beautiful, aren't they? Yeah.
And vintage slips, and I just really loved that sort of lingerie, and it was, you know, at that time people were doing things that were so colourful that you could, you know, wear all these things out, like they weren't necessarily to be hidden.
Yeah.
So I had a lingerie brand, and I did that for probably about 4 years.
Right.
And I really loved that, but you know, our lives were so different back then. You know, it wasn't really about making money. It was about going to parties, going to nightclubs, having fashion parades. You know, we put on fashion parades at all the nightclubs in Melbourne and the bars.
You're heavily involved in the gay scene, aren't you? You know, like you've got a lot of. I know people that that you know in the gay scene. So that would have all come from that era, wouldn't it?
Definitely, yeah. So there was you're probably familiar with the Fashion Design Council.
Yep.
So I was involved with the Fashion Design
Okay.
Council and would put on, you know, I had my clothes, I mean the lingerie in the fashion parades, and a friend of mine made the hats, and so it was all part of that fun. And you know, we went to great all-night raves, the ones from like the ones in the 80s.
Yeah. I probably was there.
You were probably there. You were probably there, and you know, would hang out at all the gay bars and things like that. It was just so much part of the fun of living in Melbourne.
Do you know Melbourne at that stage with the nightclubs, the metros and the chevrons and whatever, we were per head of population one of the biggest nightclub cities in the world.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
So why did you move away from that world?
So I came to a realization that I wasn't probably really good at designing.
Okay.
And perhaps it was something that was sustainable in the 80s, but then it got later, and then there was a recession, if you remember.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think that I didn't have the stamina. I didn't have really the business acumen, which, you know, I don't know if I still have yet, but I developed over time. And I just don't know if I was really set up to make it into a viable business. Like you know, I managed to sell to department stores and lots of boutiques. And so it was a business, but I didn't have the emotional and mental fortitude, I think, to really make it sustainable.
Yeah, well, that's where, and a lot of designers do, they actually have a business partner, don't they, that does all that side.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And that's probably what I could have done with.
Yep.
And then, so what happened was I decided to rethink what I was doing, and with the label, because it was hard to make a buck. It was very independent. And then my brand was bought by another company.
Yay!
Yeah.
So you made good money?
No.
Oh.
No, my brand was bought, but at least I was getting paid a wage.
Yeah.
Whereas beforehand, I don't know.
Oh, so you stayed on?
Yeah,
Right.
so I stayed on, and that was really good because then I was getting paid. I had resources, I had, you know, makers, because of course this is when everything was made in Australia, and all the makers were in Richmond, and, you know, all the little side streets of Fitzroy and Collingwood. Anyway, so he had a studio and warehouse and manufacturing spot in Abbotsford, actually. Right. He bought my label, but after 6 months, he decided it wasn't making enough money. So then he fired me.
Oh.
Yes. So basically, it's such a funny story. So basically he fired me, and when I was sitting in his office, all I could see in my mind was the skyline of New York City. And I just went, well, that's it, I'm leaving.
Whoa.
I just was like, oh, I've had enough of Melbourne. You've won. And I just decided that I just had to leave. I hadn't really done that much traveling at that point. So I was 24, and
Perfect.
I just said, right, I'm out of here. This has been fun, but it was time to explore the world.
Yep.
So I just kind of walked out the door, sold everything I had, and got on a plane and went to New York.
And how was that?
That was terrifying and amazing, and I stayed there for 10 years.
Wow.
Yep.
Wow.
So when I went over there, I thought I was going to be going into fashion.
Yep.
That was my plan. And I was like, I'm going to get a job working for Calvin Klein. So I went over there with this portfolio, this massive portfolio of all of the work, because my lingerie brand had been featured in all of the Australian fashion magazines, in Elle and in Vogue, and I'd been interviewed. And so I had lots of material. But, and I did eventually find a job. The tricky thing was back then, so this was the early 90s, they had, American companies didn't like hiring foreigners unless you were, you know, of a certain level, unless you was, you know, had so much experience. So I couldn't get a job because essentially they didn't really like employing foreigners. And back then Australians couldn't apply for the green card.
Yeah.
You couldn't get working visas.
Yeah.
Like now it's so much easier.
Yeah.
So I did get some work, and I worked for a fashion label called Nicole Miller. And she is really well known for these conversation print dresses. And anyway, and she had put together a swimwear line. And so I was designing her swimwear line.
Hey.
And that was really, really intense because you're working on 7th Avenue.
Whoa.
It's commercial, it's high intensity product turnover. It was just a world that I didn't know really anything about. So I did that for about 6 months and then realised I was not cut out for the fashion industry in that way. And maybe I also finally came to the realisation that perhaps I wasn't such a great designer after all. I was really creative, but you know, perhaps there was some practical sort of things about fashion design that was not
And that
for
you
me.
probably had to go to study it to get that
Maybe.
insight. Yep.
So I left there and I moved to Miami Beach and just started waiting tables, swimming, hanging out. I moved to Miami and took a break.
Yeah.
And sort of went, okay, I'm just going to have to rethink. What am I here for? What am I, you know, where is this going? So I spent 4 months down in Miami Beach hanging out, which was really fun. Met lots of great people. I mean, I knew people from New York. That's how I got down there.
Okay.
Friends in New York connected me with friends that were
Yeah.
living in Miami Beach, because at that time, New Yorkers would all, who were working in hospitality, would all go to Miami Beach in the New York winters. So anyway, so they were just seasonal sort of workers that would go around. So that was really fun and I had a great time. And when I was there, I did meet someone who was a New Yorker who ultimately was my long-term partner for 15 years.
Right.
So I moved back to New York and I got a job working for a fashion magazine as a stylist. And then that kept going.
And the partner had moved back to New York?
Yeah, well, I
Right.
met him at a party. He was just visiting.
Right.
I moved back and then worked in publishing. So I started as a fashion stylist. Then the publication put me on as their fashion editor.
Wow.
And then eventually, so when I was started with as the fashion editor, I decided that I really wanted to, I'd always been a really good writer. Writing was another passion of mine. You know, I studied English literature and I was a big, you know, I loved writing. So I started to train in learning how to write for media at that point. And the editor there helped train me into writing more. So I had a natural flair for it, but she then was able to kind of give me the sort of the editorial, how you work and how you sort of structure for writing for magazines.
Yep.
And I really loved working for meeting designers because I found them very inspiring because I thought of them as creatives and artists and so on. So I went around and I went to all the fashion shows, and because the magazine I worked for was not exactly a highbrow magazine, it was a trade publication.
Right.
I only ever got standing room. But myself and my fashion stylist friends, we would have our tickets to get into the fashion shows, and it would say ST for standing, and so we'd sort of like make it into a 5, 4, and so we would go in and we'd try and steal seats, and so we could sit, but otherwise we had standing room. So I met lots of fashion designers, both young and emerging, and then also high-end fashion designers, and so I would then go and interview them. I'll never forget the day I got to interview Helmut Lang. It was like the most exciting moment of my fashion career.
And what was he like?
He was so lovely.
Yeah?
But I was terrified because so Helmut Lang had just moved his whole company from Europe to the United States.
Yeah.
And he'd created this massive furore because traditionally the fashion weeks would go, I think it was London, Paris, Milan, New York came last. And he moved to New York and said, I'm going to show before all the European fashion parades, all the fashions.
I'm sure he did.
And then there was this huge schism because then half of the American fashion designers jumped over with him because they were like, oh, well, we don't come last, we come first. Anyway, so the whole years and years and years of how the very strict rules of how the fashion seasons went. I wish I could remember actually, was it London, Paris, Milan? I'm sure that someone would be able to correct me on that. Anyway, so interviewing Helmut Lang, it was really scary because he was so famous and so, European and incredibly cool. So I did a lot of writing, and then I left that job because it was a lot of work. It was very stressful. We would put out like 36 issues a year according to all the seasons when the buyers would come into New York. So it was very focused around the buying market. But I was there for a couple of years and I learnt everything I needed to know about working in the fashion world in the United States. So it was really interesting. And that's when I learnt and came across people that worked in public relations. So that's where I first began to understand what public relations was, because people, PR publicists for fashion houses and accessories companies would contact me and try to sell in their stories and give me their products. So that's where I first came in contact with the industry of public relations. Anyway, so then I went to work for Australian Consolidated Press, which is now Bauer Media, in their New York office.
How were you staying there?
I got working visas eventually. I applied for what was classified as an O visa, which was a new visa category. So because I didn't have a degree, I couldn't get the traditional visa. This new category of visa was based on preeminence in your field. And I had an excellent lawyer. And she said, all we have to do is show that you've been written about, that you've been quoted, and that you've spoken in public about your area of expertise, which I had about being in fashion. And so that's how she got me my visa.
Brilliant.
Yeah. So I had that. And then when that expired, I was then working for a magazine. So then I got the journalist visa. So I just managed to get visa after visa. It worked really well.
What brought you back to Australia?
Well, I'd been there for 10 years. I think that I don't know, I just sort of felt like my time was done. I had worked in publishing. I'd done lots of different things. I'd studied theatre design. I'd done independent theatre productions. I'd worked in costume. I'd done, was freelance writing. I had done so many fun things while I was there, travelled extensively. I think that I was in my mid-30s by this point, and I thought maybe I might want to think about having children, and maybe if I was going to do that, it would be good to do that back in Australia. Needless to say, I never ended up having any children. I moved back to Australia when I was 35, I think.
And having to start over again?
Yes, I started over again. In the latter time that I was, the last year I was in New York, I had started working for a PR company. Because a friend of mine worked there, and he had said, we're working on this Australian product, do you want to come and assist? So in my last 12 months there, I started working in PR, and I'd got to know a bit more about the public relations sector. And in those days, you didn't have, you had to ring every single editor. And I was working on a story with Lindemans, the winery. Because Lindemans wine is an Australian wine brand. But they're very well known in the US for buying basically cheap wine. And we were working on a campaign for them around the Olympics, the Sydney Olympics. Anyway, so it was such hard yakka. You had to ring every 250 journalists and editors and explain why Australian wine and food is so great. It's a wonder I ever actually stayed in the sector after that. Anyway, so I moved back to Australia. A friend of mine had a PR company and asked me to come and work for them. And that's how I got into publicity.
What about then forging your own company? What was the turning point there?
Did have a little time where I wasn't working in PR because my partner was a photographer. And so we started a photography business. And that was going really well. So we built that up from nothing in about 5 years. And then we broke up. And then I was like, well, I don't know, what am I going to do now? And then I went back to work in public relations. And then after a few years, I decided that I wanted to do publicity for the arts. And in the work I was doing, I wasn't doing much in the arts. I was doing more in fashion, a lot of hospitality, fashion, some architecture, but I really wanted to work in the arts.
Yeah.
And
but
that's
hold
how
on,
I
the only
started.
problem is that the arts is no money.
Well, funnily enough, money's never been a driving factor for me. It's true. But that was the sector that I wanted to work in. And through connections, I was able to get a few clients. And I also just wanted to run a PR company on my terms, because different publicists and have different approaches to how they do publicity. And I guess I thought that I felt strongly about the way I wanted to approach public relations in a way that not only suited my personality more, but that was more in tune with what I thought the media were after. So I started my own company in 2011, at the beginning of 2011.
I do the arts program on Joy and the Art Hunter here on Channel 31, and I'm in contact with your people all the time.
We have so many artists and so many creatives, whether it be visual arts or performing arts or circus or filmmakers. So, and of course, the Sunday Art Show is an incredible format and an incredible platform for artists to talk about their work.
So few arts programs now.
Well, you know, I think the thing is that community radio is an incredibly significant part of the work that I do. And what we find interesting is that in the arts, radio is where we're placing so many stories these days.
The struggle with the media and like trying to get placement for the arts, like you must wake up in the middle of the night going, oh, what am I doing? Why am I doing this?
I do, certainly. I mean, the thing is that after 13 years, we have a really strong relationship with most of our media outlets. And, you know, they're usually very respectful, and they'd be saying, yes, Fiona, we can do that. No. I mean, it's a constant push and pull, but that's the nature of what we do. And so it's really just about trying to craft the best stories, sending it to the journalists you think are the right journalists for it, trying to find, working with them to find a story that's specific for them.
A slant on a story.
And then it's just being realistic and being very straightforward with your clients so that they understand. You know, it's a tough sector. I mean, even if you're not in the arts, if you're in any other part of public relations, it's quite stressful, because you've got the most amount of, you know, kind of people depending on you, but you have the least ability to predict the outcome. Because unlike some of my clients, they think I write the newspaper. They're like, well, why not? And so, you know, trying to get them to understand, but we're very clear with our clients, and we give them a very strong understanding of what to expect. And then you've just got to really be straightforward and work with them and not, you know, oversell yourself.
Fiona, I congratulate you on what you're doing, because you're doing a great job, and keep on doing what you're doing. We can't lose somebody as valuable as you in this whole arena. So thank you. And thank you for doing the interview today.
Not at all. It's been really fun.
My pleasure doing it. So thank you for watching today. It was a pleasure interviewing Fiona Brook. And I'll be back again real soon on Bent TV. See ya.